Okay.
Just wanted to read that.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get started, folks. So today is going to be packed with absorbing detail and brilliant insights. And I was gripped from the first paragraph, says Alison Weir. This is a beautifully written and impeccably researched piece and quite exquisite. That's quoted by Tracy Borman. If you're visiting Tudor England, this book will sure guide you to what to look out and how to look at it. And that's a quote by Hilary Mantel. So, The King and Collector is a book about Tudor art, the stories within and around each artwork, and the story of Henry himself, as we follow his path from handsome prince to a crippled tyrant. The works reveal much about both his kingship and his insecurities. King and Collector tells this unique story of art and power, peeling back the layers of propaganda to show the true face of the most notorious of Tudor monarchs. King and Collector is a sumptuous guide to the art of Henry VIII, with analysis of what his collection of paintings and artworks reveal about the man and his reign. No English king is well known to us, as is Henry VIII, famous for 6 marriages, for dissolving the monasteries, creating the Church of England, and for the ruthless destruction of those who stood in his way. But Henry was also an ardent patron of the arts, whose tapestries, paintings, purchased in pursuit of glory and magnificence, adorned his lavish court and began the royal collection. In contrast to later royal collectors, this king was more interested in storytelling than art for its own sake, and all of his commissions relate to one central tale, the glorification of Henry and his realm. His life can be seen through this art collection, and the works tell us much about both his kingship and his insecurities. King and Collector by Linda Collins and Siobhan Clarke tells a unique story of art, power, and propaganda in Tudor England. So over to Linda and Siobhan. Linda Collins is an accredited lecturer for the Art Society and a member of the Association of Art Historians. Siobhan Clarke is a guide lecturer at Hampton Court Palace, and both authors have worked for historical royal palaces for 20 years, and both have appeared in PBS Television's Secret of Henry VIII's Palace. They have also written The Tudors, The Crown, The Dynasty, and The Golden Age. Forgive me having to read that from the piece of paper. I am not as detailed as my good lady wife is. So, lots of good stuff there, I believe.
Turn it over to
So I'm going to turn this over, according to my script here, to Miss Linda. And over to you, Miss Linda.
Okay, I'll share the screen now. Oh, I have a disabled screen sharing. The host is disabled. You have to.
Allow me.
Hi, Debs.
Hey, I'm back. Okay. I'll just have to figure out where to go to do this. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Huh. How do I do that? Spotlight for everyone? Okay.
Perfect.
She's the host
Okay.
now. There you go.
Thank you.
Right. Oh, great. And you're still there too. Well, here is our book, and that is me. And Siobhan has got the same thing further down when she takes over from me. So it's just denoting our names, and we're happy with the cover. Now, are we ready to start the lecture?
Yes, let's go ahead and do that, please.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you for listening. And I'm going to start with a little piece. I think I'm imagining that I'll be talking to you for sort of minutes or so. And then Siobhan will take over, and then we can do the questions afterwards. So this is the book. And this is the first piece that I'd like to talk to you about, because I like it very much, and there's a mystery attached to it, which is always good. And it was made by Guido Mazzoni. Guido Mazzoni was born in Modena, lived in Modena, which was the town ruled by the Este family. Isabella d'Este, for a start, probably the most famous patroness of the arts at the time. His first commission was actually to produce wedding masks for an Este wedding. But his best known work is a lamentation in the Church of Jesus in Ferrara in Italy. And his speciality is life-size terracotta statues. And they are incredible. I do have a picture of one of them to show you in a minute. The reason I like this is the mystery, really. It's been in the collection, the Royal Collection, since 1498. But we know very little else about it. It's been attributed to Mazzoni for the reasons you'll see in a minute. And it has been called Henry VIII as a 7-year-old boy. It's also been called a lot of other things as well in its time, we'll look at in the end. Now, they're made from terracotta, and terracotta is local to the area. It's cheaper, but the terracotta in this is only 5 mil thick, which is so fragile that I'm surprised from 1498 we still have it here to look at. It's interesting to see the pose of this boy as well, because when you look at his face, he has got a cheeky little face, and I think it's great, probably likely it is Henry VIII, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But look at the open mouth, the smiling mouth. A smiling face is, as you know, something that you see very rarely in paintings or sculpture, because they're so hard to do, because the smile soon turns to a grimace, and to make it natural is a very difficult thing. But he's got this open mouth, smiling. His ears are open, and so are his nostrils, because this 5 mil thick terracotta needed to be fired. And so when it was put into the kiln, the steam needed to escape from somewhere. And so the steam escaped through his ears and his nostrils and his mouth to stop the piece from breaking. Mm-hmm. And I love that cheeky little look he's got. In 1985, a lot of the overpainting on it was removed. So we're seeing it more or less as it was. When you look at the cap, for instance, that had a green glaze over it, possibly originally, we're not sure, but it was meant to make it look like cloth of gold. So to simply wear cloth of gold, we know that this boy comes from a very good background, because only a prince or the like would be able to afford to wear it. Now, Mazzoni was working for Charles VIII in France, and he was designing also a tomb for Henry VII. The plans for the tomb were sent to England, and unfortunately, he didn't get the commission. It was given to Torrigiano. But in my mind, I'm just mulling over the fact that I wouldn't be at all surprised, because the dates are correct, if this came as a sample, because a sample of how good my work is, maybe. And the reason also it was prized is that from the 1400s, we remember that we're now moving from the idea of a great piece of work would have been 1400s, something with lots of gold in it. But during the 1400s, the ideas changed, and we start to look not at the richness of the painting, but at the skill of the artist. So it's the skill that would have been prized with this. And I think there, when you look at it closely, you can see that open mouth. Look at the collar, because I'm going to show you some works in a minute, or a couple of them. The collar in the neck, the way it sits, is very much Mazzoni, very, very much Mazzoni. And I started to think, well, if this wasn't Henry VIII, who could it be? And working through Europe, it wouldn't have been his brother Arthur, because Arthur was 12 by now, and he was thinner. He wasn't the chubby child that Henry was. as I said, Mazzoni was working for Charles VIII, but looking at the children of Charles VIII, they all died early, certainly before 7. So it could have been a family member of the Este family, perhaps. But then you have to think, well, why on earth would anyone send Henry VIII of England a sculpture of a member of the Este family to which he had no relation whatsoever? So I think it all falls in the direction of this being Henry VIII. That little cheeky grin is right. But according to the records, over the years, it's also been called a Chinese boy. Yeah, you can get a feeling of that. A laughing girl, a German dwarf, which I've got no idea where that idea would have come from, or Henry VIII at 7 years old. So I'm going to go for Henry VIII at 7 years old by Mazzoni because I think it fits and it just looks like him. I'm a great fan of Mazzoni, and just to show you why this was attributed to him, get a feeling of, this is terracotta. I'll show you the image now. And this is another of his works. Now look at those faces. This is why Mazzoni was so well known and appears to have to have been the person who sculpted this other sculptor. Look at those lines in that face. I mean, this is a man that you could meet in the street. Look at the collar on the one on the left, and look at the hands of this man. You could age this man, you could age him by looking at these hands, made in terracotta in the mid-1400s, and still available. In fact, I was meant to be going in a couple of months to see it, but we can't travel here, probably no more than you can a lot, so it's been put off. But to go to the church in Ferrara and just see his work, because I love it. So I think I've enthused enough over this one, and I'm going to move on now to some tapestries, because this is another thing that I really enjoy. Here's the Great Hall at Hampton Court Palace, and hanging in the Great Hall, which was a communal dining room as well as a ceremonial place to be, were the tapestries. Imagine the tapestries with the whole room as it would have been, because the ceiling would have been blue. It would have been a deep, rich blue that the Tudors called bish or biche. And it was meant to look as though it was the open sky. The little pendants that you see hanging from the ends of the beams give you an idea of just how big this hall is, because they're just under 5 foot tall, 5 foot long. And I actually have a picture of them when the man from the Board of Works came and compared himself to them. So they do belie the size of the hall. So the tapestries would have hung there in Henry's time. They were designed by Peter Cock van Aelst, and they were woven in the William Kempenier workshop. They were after a work by Bernard van Orley, and for many years they had been attributed to him. And that is true, he did start the process, but he died. And so after the start of these tapestries, Bernard van Orley died and the work was taken over by Peter Cock van Aelst, who I believe happened to be his son-in-law as well. It's the story of Abraham. So it comes from Genesis 12. Abraham was the founder of the Hebrew nation. God ordered him to take his son Isaac to the land of Moriah and sacrifice him. And here's the full tapestry, 26 foot by 16 foot. During Henry VIII's reign, design of tapestries changed. The more medieval style of tapestries were very static. You couldn't see the story, you couldn't tell the story. You needed to have names on people before you knew who they were and what was going on. Well, that all changed, and these are said to be the first Renaissance tapestries in England because of the design of them. You can see from that billowing fabric and the movement of the creatures that the back of the tapestry is very Netherlandish because they were made in Brussels. But the figures are not. The figures are Italian. And this melding of Netherlandish design with these Michelangelo style figures was very new. Look at the man in blue to the right. Look at those muscly legs. This is actually taken from a design by Michelangelo, which appeared in one of the Salds in Italy. And he's pointing to the sacrifice at the top. It was the first time that the outside of a tapestry was connected to the story of the tapestries on the inside. And these are virtues and vices. Now, tapestries in Henry's time were more prized than paintings. They were much more valuable than paintings, and they were much more useful as well. And if you imagine that a richer noble in Henry's time may have had 50 tapestries, the richest may have had 100, Cardinal Wolsey had 600, and when Henry VIII died, there were 2,450 tapestries in his collection. They were enough that if you laid them end to end, you would have 4 miles of almost cartoon colour. They were really exceptional, these tapestries. And classical subjects mainly, because the leading tapestry workshops, as I said, were in Belgium, Brussels in particular. And that was the territory of the Holy Roman Emperor. He was obviously Catholic, the nephew, remember, of Catherine of Aragon. And so he would have supported Catherine of Aragon against Henry in the matter of the divorce. So Henry was unable to commission tapestries to be produced in his area that were critical of the Catholic faith, and possibly him himself. So they are classical subjects. You needed patience if you were going to commission tapestries, because these took a long, long time. And I wrote it down the last time I spoke to somebody, so I'm going to read this to you now. These were ordered in 1540. Now, Henry saw himself as the new Abraham. He was a prophet to his people because he'd broken away from the Church of Rome. He'd also had his son, remember, and so he can identify with Abraham and Isaac. The son was born, of course, in 1537, but he wouldn't have commissioned them immediately because he had to wait and see that the boy survived. So when the boy was about 3, in about 1540, these were commissioned. Well, then in 1540, he married Anne of Cleves. 6 months later, he divorced Anne of Cleves. Then he decided he wanted to marry Catherine Howard. 18 months later, he executed Catherine Howard. Then he married Catherine Parr at Hampton Court in 1543, which was around the time that these tapestries finally arrived. He didn't get too much time to enjoy them, of course, because 3 or 4 years later, Henry VIII died. So he was only able to enjoy them for 3 or 4 years. This is the mark of the Brussels and Brabant town mark, because they had lots of people trying to fraudulently claim that their tapestries had been woven in Brussels, because Brussels was the best place to get their tapestries produced. So they decided, I say they, the guild decided that they would have to weave into these tapestries some mark to ensure quality. And they chose the B&B, Brussels and Brabant. They would then be logged in the register, and that meant that they were truly woven Brussels tapestries. It should have been that. Of course, there's always the ones who tried to find a way around it. And what the biggest scam was that instead of weaving intricate details in the tapestry, they painted them on. Well, this was checked and the B&B was woven in, and then they would be sent out. The other mark is the weaver's mark. So on the left-hand side, you can just about see actually on the right-hand side of this image, the left-hand side of the next tapestry with the B and the B on it. And then you can see on the right-hand side, William de Kempeneer's workshop. William de Kempeneer was an entrepreneur, he must have been, because you have to set up your looms, you have to employ your weavers, you have to find your designs, and it would take at least 18 months to weave these tapestries. And there was a rule, which in Italy was very applicable, that if when they were finished, the patron didn't think that they were beautiful to the eye, he didn't have to pay for them. But we haven't seen any equivalent of this with the Brussels tapestries. The skill was immense, and the weavers were paid according to their skill. As far as I know, there were no female weavers. They were all male weavers. And the reason I say that is because that's the names that appear in the book. Perhaps there were female weavers and they just didn't get their name registered, but it's most likely it was all male weavers. An experienced weaver would be able to weave 1 square metre of coarse woolen tapestry in a month. If you go to a finer tapestry, you're talking about half a square metre a month. So it is a very skilled job. And they're woven in 2 ways, either haute lice, when the strings are in front of you, or basse lice, when the strings are below your eye level. And I've got a modern image here, just so that you can see what an haute lice weaving looks like. The cartoon, as we call it, for the tapestry, the pattern, you can see hanging on a piece of wood behind the strings. And you can see the number of bobbins that are hanging on this. Now, techniques have hardly changed since the time of the Abrahams. So this is what haute lice tapestry would have looked like. And basse lice is this, where you would be able to put the pattern behind the strings and you worked the loom with your feet as you worked. Now, it's thought probably most likely that the Abrahams were woven basse lice like this. And the materials are incredible. They come from all over. When we talk about Brexit today in Europe, the best wool came from English sheep or Spanish sheep. And that was sent to Brussels for these tapestries. Silver thread. Now, silver thread would come from Venice or Cyprus. The silk, they're made from woolen silk, would have come from Italy or Spain. And if you add silk to your tapestry, you increase it from a woolen tapestry by 4 times the price, 4 times the cost. And if you put gold and silver thread in, as these are, you increase the price by at least 20 times that of a plain wool tapestry. You also increase the weight, because putting gold and silver thread into these tapestries, you would expect the tapestry to weigh about 10 kilos for a square metre. So that is increased as well. They cost a lot at the time, at least £1,500. And it was always said that a good tapestry, as these are, would have cost the same as building and fitting a battleship like the Mary Rose. I like this image because this is obviously Isaac on the left, Abraham on the right, and the story says they're going up the hill for the sacrifice. But it looks very much, this is the time when Isaac has turned to Abraham and said, oh, hang on a minute, Dad, you've got the wood, you've got the coals, I've got the wood, who's got the lamb? And you can see in this top of the picture, to the left-hand side there, you can see a lamb neatly coming out right on cue of the forest. And this is the scene of the sacrifice, which is the scene from the baptistry doors in Florence. And the scene, I think it's 1401, the baptistry doors, there was a competition of Jacopo della Quercia, Brunelleschi, excuse me, a number of others, as to whether they would gain the commission. And the subject they gave them all was this, the sacrifice. So remember, in the hall in Tudor times, these tapestries would be hanging, they'd be gleaming in the candlelight and tapers of the day, and the subject matter would be a great conversation piece. They would have wanted to show off their knowledge of the Renaissance and to perhaps remember that this was the scene of the baptistry doors that started the whole thing off in many people's eyes. Now, on these, this is the whole one again. If you look at the size of these, they're 26 by 16, as I said. They're made from woolen silk, and in wet weather, they grow. And I find this wonderful. If you go in, and we've had a lot of thunderstorms, these almost touch the floor. They'll grow as much as 4 inches at the maximum. And then in the dry spell, they shrink up again. And it was thought that maybe they ought to be monitored to see whether this is doing them any harm. So they were monitored, and so was another tapestry that was kept under glass. And the results were filtered through to the conservation studio. And it turned out that it's better to let them do what they do best, which is absorbing and growing and shrinking, than to keep them in controlled conditions, because in controlled conditions, the fibers became brittle. They hadn't moved. And you have to remember, after all, that these were made in Brussels, which is a pretty wet part of the world to be at the best of times. And this is what they do best. The other thing you might be interested in knowing about is how they used to clean them, because of course they would get dirty. And they would have been cleaned in Henry's time, probably with bread. You would rub, I don't know if you've done this at school, I know I did. If you didn't have a rubber with you, you could use, or I should say a razor to use, shouldn't I? You could use bread, and that would remove the stain. Well, I did say, well, what about today? Because ecologically, this is the best way to do it. But the problem was mice, as you might imagine. So they wouldn't risk doing it anymore with bread because of the mice problem. What else to tell you? The insects, of course, we get infestations of insects. And I did say to Tom Campbell, who's actually now at your Metropolitan Museum, great specialist on tapestries. And I said to him, well, what about moths? Is that a problem? And he said, oh, no, no, not at all. No self-respecting moth would be interested in these old things. So what we do today, they have a blue sticky tape type thing in a piece of cardboard they leave at the bottom of the tapestry. And every so often it's checked to see what insects have fallen onto it and stuck. And if it looks like there's going to be an infestation of some insect, these are taken down, they're rolled, they're sealed in plastic, and they're put in extremely low temperatures in a freezing van for a number of weeks. They're then taken out, the plastic is slit. This is then hung onto the wall again or moved out onto a table, leaving all the insects that would have been in it frozen to death in the bottom of the plastic. So again, very ecologically sound. The other thing people ask is about hanging them, because in Tudor times, they would have hung from little rings at the top. Metal rings would have been in and they would have been put on nails. Well, we can't do that today, because if you think 1 square metre is 10 kilos, these would just simply pull themselves apart. So that's not a possibility. During my time at Hampton Court, when it was decided they wanted to represent these tapestries, there was great debate between the curator and the conservators, because the curator wanted them to hang from the top as they would have done in Tudor times. And the curator said, no way. So after going into a huddle for 6 months or so, it was finally decided on the absolute superb solution to the problem, good old 20th century Velcro. And I am assuming you call it Velcro in America as well. And that sticky stuff with little hooks on one side. And so buttons were put on the wall, and you put Velcro over the top, and then you line your tapestry, and on the lining you put Velcro on the other side, and it's almost like a fly on the wall. You just stick it on the wall, and obviously hang it with other ways as well. But if there's a fire, these have to be out very quickly, as you can imagine. Now the hall is a big hall, but to get these out, they have 5 men standing underneath it, and under the corner, which you can't see for obvious reasons, is a little pull, a wooden bead type thing, almost like we used to have in bathrooms and toilets years ago. And if you pull that, the Velcro is released, the whole tapestry falls into the arms of the 5 men underneath, and it's out in 15 seconds and safe. So from all angles, I think these are incredible tapestries. And this appealed to a sort of rather wicked sense of humour, because you have to remember, with the Kempeneer workshops, this is probably their prize commission. For Henry VIII of England, the Pope also wanted a set, and they wove them. They took all this time on each one, 5 men along the bottom for at least 18 months, all the threads coming from all over Europe at that time. And yet on the top of the tapestry, and I'll show you the full one in a minute so you can see it, is this. And it says Abraham, Divi, etc. in Latin. Abraham takes his only son. And on the third line, if you look to the left, you can see the word nittum. Well, that word nittum with an S on the end of on the beginning of the next word looks different to the rest. And the reason it looks different is it is different. It's actually it's not woven on, it's stuck on, sewn on and painted on top. Now, we don't know why. There's no thought as to what could possibly have happened apart from one very unfortunate man who may have lost his concentration and woven the wrong thing in there. Now, can you imagine this man's face when he realizes what he's done in the most prized tapestry of the whole sacrifice? I mean, he must have put his head in his hands and realized he's probably never going to work again. And that is there for us to see. So if you manage to go, take a pair of binoculars, you can see it without, but it's better with, and just have a look at this. And there we go, you can see it in the top there, center, that little mistake. So during the Civil War, these were valued at £8,260, but they weren't sold. Cardinal Mazarin of France wanted to buy them, but they were kept by the palace. And they have been used at various events, coronations of Elizabeth I in 1559. They would have hung for that in Westminster Abbey. And again for James II in 1689. Now, I'm going to leave you with the next image, which I think I was lucky to take this. I can see the date on it as 2007 when I was working there. Somebody had said, can we be given an idea of what they looked like to Tudors, to Henry VIII? How did he see these? Well, then it was decided that we wanted to find out the depth of colours. Now, this happened and it was so easy. They brought people in, I think it was Cambridge University, might have been Oxford, I'm not sure. But the first thing that this scientist did was to take a light reading from under the selvages of these tapestries. I've seen under the selvages and they're almost like Kellogg's cornflake packets. They are so bright, they're like cartoons. So they take a reading of that. They know what the colour would have been, the reading of the colour in Henry's time. They then take a reading from the front where it's faded, and they take one reading away from the other one, which tells them how much colour has been lost since 1540. And then that amount of colour is very cleverly made into a 35mm slide, colour slide, and projected onto the tapestry. So we know that that is the depth of colour in that little part there at the bottom that Henry VIII would have seen. And just looking at the faces here, look at the faces of that couple on the left-hand side with her hat on, and her, you can even see that's still a blue ribbon tied around her hat. And then the details in this, and the man right to the right-hand side, look at that face with the hair, the beard, the blowing in the wind, and the animals themselves. And as you can tell, I really love these. You might have missed the camels actually coming in at the top left-hand side, but they are great. I love them. And I hope I've projected my enthusiasm for them onto you, because I'm now going to pass over to Siobhan, and she'll be taking over from me with some more works of art. So thank you very much. If there's any questions afterwards, we'll try our best to answer them. Over to you, Siobhan.
Thank you, Linda. So welcome everyone. In this book, we've really produced a hybrid. It's a history book and an art book combined. And what we're trying to do is tell Henry's life story, which has obviously been done many times before, but using art as a gateway into that life, which we don't think has really been done before. Excuse me. And I've learned a lot through the course of this about the artworks. I knew that artworks were important to Henry, that storytelling was very important, but I don't think I was I was aware, really, that his importance as a collector. We believe that he can be argued to be the founder of the royal collection. So he's very important in that respect. And I don't think I was quite aware of the fact that his artworks indicate insecurities that the king might have had. A good example of this is in the Whitehall mural, which we cover this in the book. It gives a really good understanding of Henry's relationship with his father and the insecurities that he felt about Henry VII. And also paintings like the Battle of the Spurs that we cover in the book, which was really quite a minor skirmish, but this glorious painting is produced just because Henry was there and it was a minor success, whereas there's a really triumphant battle going on in England at the same time, Flodden, which is not commemorated in paint because Henry wasn't there. So these are just a few examples. But what I'm going to talk about, and if Linda can move on to the next slide, what I want to focus in on today is the Field of the Cloth of Gold. So where in the Battle of the Spurs we see Henry as a young man ready to fight, keen to assert himself as a warrior, as a knight, and to further his claim to, or his desire to one day rule France, everything seems to be turned around by 1520. Henry is now, rather than being a warrior, he's learning the art of diplomacy. And this comes about through Cardinal Wolsey. We can see him here on the right-hand side. He's promoting the idea of Henry as a Renaissance prince and as a peacemaker. It really came about because the Pope was worried about all of these Christian princes fighting each other when there were infidels, when there were perhaps more serious enemies abroad. So it was an idea that people like Henry VIII and Francois, who we can see here on the bottom left, the King of France, that these Christian princes should come together in friendship rather than in battle. So there's an idea that these two rivals, these two young kings, should meet to promote this idea of peace. And it's a kind of conference, like a summit meeting that's arranged. Wolsey is the great administrator, and he essentially organizes this meeting in France in 1520. And it's gone down in history known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold. We do have an exhibition opening at Hampton Court Palace. It was meant to open last year, but got postponed for obvious reasons. So it's now opening this year. It opens in May and it will run until September. So if anyone does make it over to the UK, you will be able to come to Hampton Court Palace and see this incredible exhibition. And we've got lots of really interesting paintings and other artifacts celebrating this incredible meeting at the Cloth of Gold. So just before we move on to look at the painting itself, just to be aware of the two protagonists that I'm talking about, Henry and Francois. They're both in their 20s, they're both young Renaissance princes, both very keen to show themselves as cultured and athletic as well, and both following the code of true knights, to be equally as good at dancing as they will be at jousting, and very much in competition with each other. So if we can now move on to the next slide. And here it is. So this meeting is arranged and Henry travels over with his entourage of 6,000, and Francois has the same. And they decide that they're going to meet at a place called Guines. Now, England still has Calais at this time, so that provides a really good base for Henry and his entourage. They arrive in Calais, and then from there, they're able to transport everything they need to Guines, where they will meet the French. And they really do bring everything that they need because they don't want to have to ask the French for anything. Also, ale and beer was, the quality of the ale and beer was rather suspect on the other side of the channel. So they're fully prepared to bring what they need with them, even if that involves making their own bread ovens and brewing their own ale. They'll also bring livestock with them, plate, cutlery, tapestries, everything to decorate the tents and the temporary palace that Henry's going to live in. It's all transported with them. So we can see all that going on in this painting. And the wonderful thing about the painting is that it gives us a true sense of what it would be like to be there. You can almost hear the noise of the people there, the horses, the boom of the cannons that you can see there. They're firing a sort of celebratory boom. And it's just so evocative. It's very easy to imagine yourself there. It gets its name, Field of the Cloth of Gold, because the idea was that if you were looking down from hilltops nearby, you would be looking down on a field of gold. And this is from the tapestries and the rich textiles on display, and particularly the gold tents that we can see here in the background. I'll talk about the temporary palace a little bit later. Let's just for a moment focus in on the people that we can see in the painting, and particularly on the retinue that's arriving. So if we can move on to the next slide. Okay, and here we can quite clearly see Henry and some of the people that are with him. And again, we can see these guns booming in the background. Now, the painting was painted about 20 to 25 years after the event. We don't know exactly why he would have waited so long to commemorate the Field of the Cloth of Gold. We don't even know that Henry commissioned it. Perhaps there was an earlier version of the event. It's possible that he, if he did commission it, he may have done it because he was expecting a French deputation in the 1540s, which did indeed arrive, and it may have been to remind them of times when the two countries were at peace. So we're not entirely sure. But what's interesting is if we can, and again, if Linda, if you can just press on to the next slide, we're zooming in, and look at Cardinal Wolsey here riding beside the king, and he's in a very plain robe. The cardinal, we normally think of him dressed in red, his cardinal's robes. Now, it may be that he was dressed plainly so as not to outshine the king, but it's actually more likely that he's being portrayed in this way because the painting was done in the 1540s, long after Wolsey's fall. Wolsey has fallen from favour in 1529, so he's not important anymore. So he's not being shown in his red cardinal robes. He's looking almost merging into the background and not outshining Henry. Another figure that we can recognise as being someone from the time is Charles Brandon, and we can see him behind the king, Henry's best friend and brother-in-law. So there are recognisable characters in the painting. I think we can go in a little bit closer. If you press again, Linda. Oh, no, can you go back? Sorry, I thought. Thank you. Sorry, I thought I had another close-up. Okay, so let's just have a look at Henry's head. Originally, the figure of Henry was probably facing straight ahead, like all the other characters in profile. But there's a mystery here. There's a circle around the king's head. The head was actually removed from the painting. There are a couple of different theories. One is that the head was removed to stop the painting from being sold during the Commonwealth period after the English Civil War, when Charles I's great art collection was being dispersed and sold off. So that's a good theory. Another theory is that it was deliberately damaged by Spanish envoys who'd come over to see James I in the early 1600s, and that they were disgruntled and that they deliberately vandalized the painting. We can't be 100% sure. but someone removed the head from Henry's head from this painting, and then it was replaced. And when it was replaced, it's been replaced with Henry, and it's the Holbein image, the later image of Henry, an older Henry, and it's replaced with an image of Henry staring straight out at us, which quite cleverly grabs our attention, just as he grabs our attention in the Whitehall mural by looking at us straight on. So if we can now move on again, Linda. Okay, so the two kings arrive with their entourage. They're prepared to stay for around about 2 weeks, 18 days in June 1520. As I've mentioned, each accompanied by 6,000 courtiers and servants, and everyone's going to be fed and clothed and entertained to the very highest level. And but what's constant is this idea of rivalry. There's going to be jousting, there's going to be games, even the feasting is about rivalry. They're competing with each other constantly. And at one point, the sound of trumpet, they leave their respective camps and they ride across the countryside, racing towards each other in mock combat, turning their horses away at the last minute. And it reminds us that this is a game. It's horseplay between two young men in their 20s who just happen to be kings. And the reason for all this rivalry and the magnificence and both of them spending so much money is completely political. They're both saying, look, I'm coming in friendship, but just look at what I can do. And this is in friendship, in peace. Think what I could do if I came at you in war. And next slide, please. So I mentioned that the English party took everything that they could possibly need. And here we can see the bread being baked here on the right. And then to the left, we can see this wonderful wine fountain. Oh, and up above, I've listed some of the provisions that they brought with them, the wine, the beer, some of the food, which even included 3 porpoises, which is like a kind of dolphin. So you can imagine the magnificence on display. But the wine fountain really attracts your attention when you look at this painting. And it really did run with wine constantly for the whole of the event. And people really did help themselves. And if we look closely, we can see them misbehaving, fighting, quarreling, falling asleep, even someone being sick in the background. And also what's interesting about this painting is that when you look at it, you can see not just the courtiers of the entourage, but some ordinary Tudors whom we don't often see in paintings, for obvious reasons. It's normally the elite that are painted. So it's giving us a glimpse of some ordinary people in the background. And then the next slide, please. Okay, so we're back to looking at the larger painting now. In the top right, we can see the tilt yard. And there are 4 figures there who are Henry VIII, Francois, and their respective queens, Catherine of Aragon and Queen Claude. And they're there to watch the jousting. And again, there's very much the two sides very much competing with each other. An act of peace, but there's a feeling that, underneath, there's an underlying feeling all the time of what they could do if they were actually at war with each other. Henry's happily married to Catherine of Aragon at this point, but Anne Boleyn is there at the Field of the Cloth of Gold. She's in the entourage of Queen Claude, but Henry hasn't noticed her at this point. Then you can see all the various tents. Now, Henry VIII isn't going to sleep in a tent, even just for 2 weeks. So he built this amazing palace, a temporary palace, made with brick for the foundations, and then with timber and canvas, and made to look as if it's a real palace, even with the embellishments around it, this outer layer of propaganda that we can see. And inside there was tapestries and magnificent lodgings. It had stained glass. The French actually called it the Crystal Palace, which is a wonderful name because of all the glass in the palace. And it says everything about Henry VIII, that he would go to the trouble of building something like this. just for an event. And then if we can just have the next, yes, thank you. A religious mass brought the meeting, finally brought the meeting to a close, with Wolsey forgiving the sins of everyone present. And then the crowd marvelled at a creature flying through the sky. It had been created by the English, and it's a combination of a dragon and a salamander. It's actually a kite, but it contained fireworks, which made its eyes blaze and its mouth hiss. So that must have been an incredible sight to see this right at the end. It was pulled through the air by being attached to a carriage. So after all the money spent and all the magnificence and the great display, the Field of the Cloth of Gold went down in history as one of the most spectacular events of the Tudor period. But it didn't really achieve anything except for the two sides showing off their power, because they were at war with each other within 2 years. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so that's a very good example. The Field of the Cloth of Gold is a really good example of an artwork telling us a lot about Henry, about his kingship and his magnificence. And another very important example, which you can also see at Hampton Court Palace, is the family painting of Henry VIII, which is dated around 1545. We don't know who painted it. Holbein was dead. He died in 1543. If he'd still been alive, think what we'd be looking at when we look at this painting. And when we do look at the painting, what's important to remember is that Henry would have stood in front of it. The king had green and white curtains covering the painting, and he would pull on a cord and the curtains would open when he wanted to look at it. And that would add to a sense of theatre. So something important has happened by 1545, and the third act of succession has been passed, and Henry's put his daughters back into the succession. He's thought about the unthinkable. What might happen if his son Edward died? Henry actually doesn't have a lot of heirs to the throne. And this painting is about showing the dynasty, and it's almost a fantasy in a way about showing that he does have a lot of suitable heirs. By putting his daughters back into the succession, he's saying, if anything happens to Edward, Mary will become queen, and then Elizabeth. And we can see the whole family here in this painting. The important people in the centre are Henry, Jane Seymour sitting beside him, and his son Edward by his side. The painting is a bit like a triptych in 3 sections. Where you would normally see the Holy Family in the centre, we have this royal family. And then the 2 daughters are on the left and the right-hand side, relegated to the wings, along with these fools or jesters. The Lady Mary can be seen on the left, and to her left is a woman called Jane. The Lady Elizabeth is on the right, and to her right is Will Summer, the king's own jester. Notice that the girls are divided off by pillars, confirming that they fall outside of the field of legitimacy. When we look into the painting, we see the richness and magnificence of a Tudor palace. The palaces were brightly painted on the outside and just as bright and colourful inside. So it's giving us a lot of information. I mean, you can look up and you can see Tudor roses in the ceiling. You can see tiles on the floor, the canopy above the king's head. It's also set at Whitehall Palace, a vestibule there. So that makes it very special because it's a tantalising glimpse into a lost palace that we no longer have. And then if you can press again, Linda, there we go. And we can even see the gardens at Whitehall Palace when we look through this archway and the beasts on poles. We can see the little greyhound of Richmond there on a tall green pole. And Will Somer was the king's personal jester, someone who was very close to the king. On his shoulder, a little monkey known as the king's ape. And there are records in Henry's wardrobe accounts for tiny doublets and little outfits that were ordered for this pet monkey. This is probably faded. It would have been some kind of crimson outfit that the monkey was wearing. I get asked constantly, why are there fools in this painting? And it's a good question. And the answer is we cannot know for certain. But what we do know is that these people held a special place at the Tudor court. Will Somer appears in lots of paintings with Henry VIII. He was someone close to the king, someone who could perhaps cheer him up when Henry was miserable, and the king did suffer from depression when he was older, when he was ill. The woman called Jane was a fool in the household of Anne Boleyn, and then Catherine Parr, and then the Lady Mary. So she also had a long history at court. Fools were usually people with learning difficulties. They were thought to speak the truth. They were often thought of as innocents, and there was a sense that they were in some way holy. This was written about by Erasmus, the great humanist, who felt that fools had this almost a divine holiness, because they would just say, whatever was on their minds. There was no artifice about fools. Will Somer would often voice uncomfortable truths, for which Henry would sometimes lash out. But that could be the reason why they're here in this painting. They're just part of the household, people who are close to the family. What's really significant about the painting is this idea that it is about the succession, it is about the dynasty, and there's a great irony. So if we can go on to the next one, Linda. Yeah, so here we get in closer. We can see Henry with his son and heir Edward by his side, but the irony is that his true successor is actually his daughter Elizabeth, who had been relegated to the wings as illegitimate. And just before I explain about that, let's focus in a bit on Henry. In this painting in 1545, he's only got 2 years to live. And he was actually very ill by this time. He can hardly walk. They even had a kind of stair lift at Whitehall Palace. Dr. David Starkey has found evidence of a stair lift there. We know that Henry had to be hoisted onto his horse by this time. And there was a chair or throne that they called a tram with wheels on it. So he was the first wheelchair user within our palaces. His legs would have been bandaged because of the ulcers on his legs, and he had a 54-inch waist, so he was really obese by this stage. So clearly the artist is flattering the king by making him look a little bit younger and a little bit slimmer. And it doesn't look like Edward either. This little figure has been plumped out and padded. But that's not important. None of the figures are particularly lifelike. What's important is just what they symbolize. They didn't get together for the painting. They were all sketched separately, and then the whole thing was sort of put together. Jane's image is based on an earlier Holbein painting, which now hangs in Vienna, and Henry's image is pretty much based on Holbein's Whitehall mural. So I said that there's an irony that Henry's true successor is Elizabeth. At this stage in this painting, no one really thinks that there's a great chance Elizabeth will ever come to the throne, but of course she does in 1558, very much the lion's cub. Her long reign will allow the arts to flourish. Her religious settlement will do much to heal the country. And this is a country very much divided between Catholicism and the new Protestant religion. And Elizabeth does try to consolidate that. And the defeat of the Spanish Armada will be one of the greatest victories in our history. So there's no doubt that she reigned over a golden age and is still today considered one of the greatest monarchs we ever had. And this is the irony, that Henry didn't know how things would turn out. And indeed, he would have been very proud of his daughter had he known. And then if we go in again, Linda, if you press again. Yeah, so if we look closely at Elizabeth, we can see she's actually wearing the A necklace that belonged to her executed mother. Anne Boleyn had an A as well as a B. Now, there's a few different theories because they were the girls were sketched, and one theory is that Elizabeth wore it for the sketch, and that her father was if he knew about it, he may have been displeased by it, so it was very bold of her to do so. But then another theory is maybe Henry didn't mind because the A identifies Elizabeth for who she is. My own thinking is that the A was added later in Elizabeth's own reign, because we know that the painting was hanging then in the Privy Chamber at Whitehall. But so again, we cannot be exactly sure, but it's nice that she's wearing, I think, the A necklace, because Elizabeth herself was probably her mother's greatest legacy. So this is a very good example of the art of Henry VIII and how just in one painting we get so much information, and not just the physical information about the palace, but maybe an insight into what's going on in Henry's mind at the time, especially towards the end of his life, and how exactly how he felt about his children. And as I said as well, I think a great way of summing up the Tudor dynasty. So that really brings us, if you just go on, Linda, to the last slide. Yeah, so that really brings us to the end of, and I think it's also very apt what Sir Walter Raleigh said about the pictures and patterns of a merciless prince. Henry VIII is more or less known to people for being rather infamous. I mean, he's been described as the English Stalin by one historian, and it can be a bit one-sided. I mean, he got a very bad press by the Victorians. It was in the 19th century that a paper was published by a medical historian suggesting that Henry had had syphilis. The Victorians thought he was a womanizer, which he wasn't, and he didn't have syphilis. And then, of course, Holbein's mural has given us this image of someone rather frightening. So I hope that in the book we've tried to give a more balanced view of Henry VIII, not as this terrifying, infamous figure, but as a more rounded character. He was a complex and contradictory man who also gave us the beginnings of the Royal Collection, and was an ardent and passionate patron of the arts. But I would qualify that by adding that it's always important to remember that Henry did not choose art for its own sake. He's not a connoisseur in the way that, say, Charles I was. He did love the arts, and he did want to promote the arts, and he did much for the sake of art in England. But everything about his commissions comes back to one central theme: the glorification of Henry VIII and his England. Thank you. Right, that's it.
Thank you. That was wonderful. May I ask 4 quick questions? I know you've spent a lot of time on this, and I really appreciate that. I'd like to know what inspired this book for you.
Well, we both worked, as I've said, we both worked at Hampton Court Palace for a very long time. And so I've been talking about Henry for years, and looking at the paintings and taking people around the palace, of course, talking about the paintings. And we just thought that it would be, it'd be really nice to write something about it, to try and explore his life through his artworks.
Also, Siobhan, we used to go around the palace together, as Siobhan and I, and of course I'd be looking at the paintings and Siobhan would be looking at the history. So I'm an art historian and Siobhan is a historian, and so it seemed a natural thing to do, to each choose our own area, if you like, to build on. And that's what made us think, because I don't think anyone's done it in this way before.
It's just fascinating the way you've worked everything in together. And I know just from being at Hampton Court Palace quite a few times and seeing the tapestries and standing in front of the picture of Henry and his family, just the majesty. I mean, they're so magnificent, and to learn this history and this intricate detail is really fascinating. So I'm very glad you did this. My next question, how long did it take you to put the project together?
Do you know, off the top of my head, I would have said 7 or 8 months.
Yeah, less than a year.
Yeah, a lot less than a year.
It didn't,
because they're things we knew anyway. So all we're doing, we're just expressing them.
Exactly. So it's not like you're starting from scratch with research. It's a long process when you're putting a book together, because you've got the editing process and it goes backwards and forwards, and finding illustrations, and that's why that's why it's time consuming. But the actual writing of it didn't really take that long.
No, and it was lucky in a way, because we were locked down anyway. So we had something to do through lockdown.
And we're so glad you did it as well. And next question, who's your favorite Tudor? Or shall I pronounce it Tudor?
I think for me, I would say Elizabeth.
Yeah, most people do, because there are aspects of Elizabeth that modern people can relate to. There's a tolerance about Elizabeth that you just don't find with the other Tudors. I mean, there's loads of instances of people who upset Elizabeth, and she did send quite a few people to the Tower, but she didn't execute them. People like Lady Margaret Douglas, who Henry wouldn't have hesitated, but Elizabeth was very reluctant to execute. I mean, even Mary Queen of Scots, whom Elizabeth didn't want to execute her, even when she was shown absolute proof that Mary was plotting for Elizabeth to be assassinated. There's definitely a tolerance about Elizabeth that we can relate to, whereas with Henry, he seems almost like a psychopath, really. That there's
That's right.
Yeah, there's no empathy, when it comes to the destruction of people. He can quite calmly, sign death warrants. Where Elizabeth couldn't, she hated executing people and only did it when she absolutely had to.
I think for me though, it's because I'm looking at the portraits, it's the clothes, the jewelry, the makeup. That's what really I like about Elizabeth. It's such a glamorous way to be, and getting to the end of her life, like almost ironic, because she didn't look like that. She wasn't 25 anymore. And the sadness of an old lady still trying to project this image of the young girl.
Yeah.
And certainly the portraits, I think, of Elizabeth. And I have to say, we're writing on her at the moment, Siobhan and I. So there'll be another book out next year on Elizabeth, the same thing.
That's perfect. And that's my next question. So you already answered that, and I really can't wait, because I'm like you, she's very fascinating. She is the ruler that her father wanted, and he just never imagined that it would be a female. And she's fascinating, the way the arts flourished. Like you said, she was such a political power, and her indecisiveness actually worked to her favor. But, you know, did she do it on purpose? Did she do it because she had a heart? She's just a fascinating character, and I'm glad we have that in common. So thank you very, very much for your time. I appreciate it, and you're welcome back anytime. And speaking for All Things Tudor, we can't wait to have you back when your book on Elizabeth comes out.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And a goodbye to everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.